It started with a neon blazer and a clipboard, the kind of power move only an HOA president could pull off. Marching onto my land, heels clicking like a warning siren, and declaring that my cabin disrupted the landscape and posed a security concern. I live alone, on my own road, in the middle of the woods. No neighbors, no problems. At least not until Whitney Langford came into power and decided my private access road was her business, so she blocked it. Literally, concrete barriers, signs, warnings. What she didn't realize was that road didn't belong to the HOA. It belonged to me. And within days, I turned it into a toll road. Every car in the neighborhood had to pay, by law, to use it. I'm Gavin, and this is how I made the HOA regret ever seeing green paint and independence. My name is Gavin Mercer, and 2 years ago, after my divorce was finalized, I bought a small cabin in Pine Valley. It's about 45 minutes outside the city, tucked away among towering pine trees, and far enough from civilization that I can actually hear myself think. As a freelance software engineer, I spend most of my weekdays staring at screens in my downtown apartment, debugging code and dealing with client deadlines. But weekends? Weekends belong to me and my cabin. I'd drive up Friday evenings, breathe in that crisp mountain air, and remember what peace felt like. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, built back in 1987 by some guy who clearly valued function over form. But it had good bones, a wraparound porch, and windows that let in just the right amount of morning light. When I first bought it, the exterior was this bland beige color that made it look like every other boring structure you'd see in a suburban development. So naturally, I decided to give it some personality. I spent 3 weekends painting it a deep forest green with cream trim. It looked perfect against the backdrop of pine trees, like it actually belonged in the woods instead of trying to pretend it was somewhere else. I was proud of that paint job, the way you get proud of small accomplishments that nobody else really cares about but mean something to you. I thought I'd finally found my sanctuary, my place to recharge and work on personal projects without anyone bothering me about anything. I should have known better. Because apparently, even in the middle of nowhere, there's always someone ready to tell you you're doing it wrong. Her name was Whitney Langford, and she was about to turn my peaceful retreat into a battlefield I never asked to join. It was a Saturday morning in early October, one of those perfect autumn days when the air is crisp but the sun still has some warmth to it. I was sitting on my porch with my coffee, checking emails, and enjoying the kind of silence you can't buy in the city. That's when I heard the car doors slamming. Not one, but 2 car doors, followed by the sound of high heels clicking on gravel. High heels on gravel. At 7:30 in the morning, on a Saturday, in the middle of the woods. I knew right then that my peaceful morning was about to become something else entirely. The woman walking toward my cabin was impossible to miss. She was wearing a neon yellow blazer that probably glowed in the dark, paired with black slacks and heels that were completely inappropriate for the terrain. Her blonde hair was styled in one of those aggressive business cuts, and she was carrying a clipboard like it was a weapon. Behind her walked another woman, older, with the kind of stern expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. The blonde woman strode up to my porch with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her life. She extended her hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Good morning, I'm Whitney Langford, president of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association. This is Colleen Miller, our secretary. We need to discuss some concerns about your property." I set down my coffee and shook her hand, noting that her grip was unnecessarily firm, like she was trying to establish dominance through hand pressure. "Good morning," I replied. "I'm Gavin Mercer. What kind of concerns?" Whitney's smile wavered slightly, as if she'd expected me to be more intimidated. She glanced at her clipboard, then back at me. "Well, Mr. Mercer, your cabin is affecting the landscape and causing security concerns for our community. The color choice is particularly problematic, and residents have expressed discomfort with the isolated structure and unusual activity patterns." I blinked at her, trying to process what I'd just heard. "I'm sorry, what? Unusual activity patterns? I come here on weekends to work and relax. What's unusual about that?" Colleen stepped forward, pen poised over her clipboard like she was documenting evidence for a criminal trial. "The property modifications were made without proper consultation with the Homeowners Association," she said in a voice that suggested she'd practiced this speech. "Additionally, the current exterior aesthetics are non-compliant with community standards, and the isolated nature of the structure presents potential security risks." I looked from one woman to the other, my engineering brain trying to logic through what was happening. My cabin was clearly separated from the main neighborhood by at least half a mile of trees. I could barely see other houses from my property, and they certainly couldn't see mine. "Security risks?" I asked. "What kind of security risks are we talking about?" Whitney's expression hardened. Mr. Mercer, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation. The Pine Valley Homeowners Association has standards, and those standards exist to protect property values and ensure community safety. Your unauthorized modifications and non-compliant color scheme are violations that need to be addressed immediately. She nodded to Colleen, who handed me an official-looking document. This is a formal violation notice, Whitney continued. You have 30 days to correct these issues, or you'll face fines of $200 per day until compliance is achieved. I took the paper and scanned it quickly. It was full of legal-sounding language that basically boiled down to, paint your house beige or pay us, every day until you do. And if I refuse? I asked, more out of curiosity than defiance. Whitney's smile returned, but this time it had sharp edges. Then we'll explore every legal avenue available to ensure compliance. The HOA has significant authority in these matters, Mr. Mercer. I'd strongly advise cooperation. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at me. 30 days, she repeated. We'll be in touch. I watched them walk back to their cars, Whitney's heels still clicking aggressively on the gravel. As they drove away, I noticed an elderly woman across the way tending to her garden. She was watching the whole scene and shaking her head. Something told me she'd seen this performance before. I looked down at the violation notice in my hands and felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Not fear, not anger, but curiosity. Because something about this whole situation didn't add up, and I had a feeling Whitney Langford had just made a very expensive mistake. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, a cup of coffee, and a growing sense that I was about to learn more about property law than I'd ever wanted to know. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I pulled up the Pine Valley Homeowners Association website and started reading. What I found was interesting, but what I didn't find was even more interesting. There was plenty of information about dues, meetings, and community standards, but absolutely nothing about the specific boundaries of their authority. Nothing about which properties were actually subject to their rules, and definitely nothing about when those rules had been established. I made a mental note to dig deeper, but first, I wanted to talk to that woman I'd seen in the garden. Sunday morning found me knocking on the door of the house across the way, feeling slightly awkward about introducing myself under these circumstances. The woman who answered was probably in her late 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that suggested she didn't miss much. "You must be the young man with the green cabin," she said before I could introduce myself. "I'm Evelyn Monroe. I saw Whitney's little performance yesterday. Come in and let's talk about what you're really dealing with." Evelyn's living room had the comfortable feel of someone who'd actually lived there for decades, with family photos and well-organized bookshelves. She poured us both coffee and settled into her chair with the air of someone preparing to tell a long story. "How long have you lived here?" I asked. 23 years, she replied. "Long enough to see what Whitney's been doing to this community. You're not the first person she's targeted, Gavin. In the last 18 months, she's gone after 7 different homeowners with various violations. One family actually sold their house and moved rather than deal with her constant harassment. That got my attention. What kind of violations?" Evelyn's expression darkened. "Everything you can imagine. Garden designs that were supposedly non-compliant, outdoor furniture that was the wrong color, a doghouse that was apparently too large. She even cited someone for having their garage door open too frequently." She paused, studying my face. "But here's what's interesting. I used to work as a paralegal, so I know something about property law. Whitney's been operating outside her authority more often than not." Evelyn stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. "When I started getting harassed about my garden last year, I did some research. The Pine Valley HOA was established in 1995, 8 years after your cabin was built. Your cabin and several other properties in this area were grandfathered in." She handed me several photocopied documents, including property surveys, incorporation papers, and boundary maps. But more importantly, she pulled out a hand-drawn map covered in red ink. "Your cabin isn't just grandfathered in, it's completely outside the HOA's jurisdiction. See this boundary line? Your property is on the other side of it." I stared at the map, cross-referencing it with the other documents. She was absolutely right. My property was clearly outside the boundaries of the Homeowners Association, which meant Whitney had no legal right to cite me for violations or demand that I change anything. But there was something else on that map that caught my attention. The road leading to my cabin was marked as a private easement, not a public thoroughfare. "Evelyn," I said slowly, "this road that leads to my cabin, who owns it?" She followed my finger on the map and smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "According to this survey, it's part of your property, a private access road. But here's the interesting part. For the last 15 years, at least 30 residents have been using that road as a shortcut to get to the community park. They cut through your property every single day, and technically, they've been trespassing. I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite excitement, but definitely satisfaction. Whitney thought she could intimidate me with legal threats. She had no idea what kind of legal complications she'd just created for herself. I spent the rest of Sunday afternoon calling lawyers, and by Monday morning I had an appointment with Spencer Wallace, a property attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Spencer reviewed my documents while I explained the situation, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Yes, sir. You have what we call a very strong position. Your property is clearly outside the HOA's jurisdiction, and you own the access road that multiple residents use daily without permission." He tapped his pen on the desk. "The question is, what do you want to do about it? You could simply inform the HOA that they have no authority over your property and demand they retract the violation notice. That would be the simple approach." He paused. "Or you could take a more proactive stance. Since you own a private road that's being used by residents without permission, you have the legal right to control access, and even charge fees for usage. It's called a private toll road, and it's completely legal in this state." I felt a slow smile spreading across my face. Whitney wanted to play legal hardball? Fine. But she had no idea she was playing against someone who actually understood the rules. That evening, I drove home to my cabin with a head full of possibilities and a folder full of legal documentation. As I turned onto my private road, I counted the cars passing by. 12 vehicles in 15 minutes, all taking the shortcut through my property to reach the community park. 12 vehicles whose owners were about to learn that sometimes property rights mattered more than convenience. I parked in front of my cabin and sat on the porch, watching the sun set through the pine trees. Tomorrow, I was going to have another conversation with Whitney Langford. But this time, I'd be the one with the legal documentation and the upper hand. Tuesday morning, I called the HOA office and requested a meeting with Whitney to discuss the violation notice. The woman who answered the phone, who I assumed was Colleen, seemed surprised by my polite tone and professional approach. "Mrs. Langford is very busy," she said, "but she might be able to fit you in this afternoon." I could hear the subtext. Whitney was expecting me to come in hat in hand, ready to negotiate my surrender. She was going to be disappointed. The HOA office turned out to be a converted section of Whitney's house, complete with official-looking furniture and certificates hanging on the walls. Whitney was sitting behind a large desk, wearing a bright purple blazer that somehow managed to be both professional and attention-seeking at the same time. Colleen sat in the corner with her ever-present clipboard, ready to document whatever confession or capitulation I was about to offer. "Mr. Mercer," Whitney said without standing up, "I'm glad to see you're taking this matter seriously. I trust you're here to discuss your compliance timeline?" I sat down across from her and placed my folder on the desk. "Actually, I'm here to discuss the legal boundaries of your authority." Whitney's smile flickered slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I'm not sure what you mean. The HOA's authority is clearly established in our bylaws and covenants." I opened my folder and pulled out the property survey. According to this official county survey, my cabin is located outside the established boundaries of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association. You have no legal authority over my property. I slid the document across the desk to her. Whitney barely glanced at the survey before pushing it back toward me. "That survey must be incorrect," she said dismissively. "Or perhaps it's outdated. Property boundaries can change, Mr. Mercer, but HOA jurisdiction is established through different mechanisms." Colleen nodded vigorously from her corner, as if Whitney had just delivered a brilliant legal argument. I pulled out another document. This is the original incorporation filing for the Pine Valley HOA, dated 1995. My cabin was built in 1987. Even if I were within your boundaries, which I'm not, the property would be grandfathered in and exempt from your regulations. For the first time, Whitney's professional mask slipped slightly. She grabbed the incorporation documents and scanned them quickly, her jaw tightening as she read. "Mr. Mercer," she said finally, "I don't know where you got these documents, but I assure you that the HOA has been managing this community effectively for years. We're not going to let one resident undermine the standards that protect everyone's property values." She stood up, her purple blazer somehow seeming more aggressive than before. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave now. You have 28 days remaining to correct your violations. I suggest you use that time wisely." I gathered my documents and stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Mrs. Langford, there's one more thing you should know. The road leading to my cabin, It's a private easement that belongs to me. I've been documenting the traffic that uses it daily, and I'm considering exercising my property rights regarding unauthorized usage. Whitney's face went pale, then flushed red. You can't block that road, she said. Residents have been using it for years. It's a community access route. I smiled. Actually, I can do whatever I want with my private property. Have a good day, Mrs. Langford. I left the HOA office feeling like I'd just lit a very short fuse. I wasn't wrong. By Thursday afternoon, I returned to my cabin to find concrete barriers blocking the entrance to my road. There was a handwritten sign attached to one of the barriers, "Road closed for community safety, Pine Valley HOA." Standing next to the barriers was a burly man in work clothes holding a clipboard of his own. When he saw me approaching, he straightened up with the air of someone who'd been instructed to be intimidating. "You can't come through here," he announced. "Roads closed by order of the Homeowners Association." I parked my car and got out, noting that this was clearly Troy Huxley, the contractor whose name appeared on several HOA maintenance contracts I'd researched. "This is a private road," I told him calmly. "Those barriers are on my property without my permission. I'm going to have to ask you to remove them." Troy crossed his arms and stood his ground. "Lady in charge says the road stays closed until you fix your violations. You got a problem with that? Take it up with her." I pulled out my phone and took several photos of the barriers, making sure to get Troy's face and license plate in the shots. "I'll be taking it up with several people," I said. "Have a nice day." By Friday morning, the barriers had attracted quite an audience. Residents who normally used my road as a shortcut were backing up in both directions, some getting out of their cars to examine the situation. I could see Whitney's house from where I parked, and I watched her standing at her window, arms crossed, surveying her handiwork with obvious satisfaction. That's when I realized she'd made a critical error in judgment. She thought blocking my access would force me to comply with her demands. What she'd actually done was create an extremely public demonstration of her overreach, complete with witnesses and frustrated residents who were now late for work because of her power play. I called Spencer Wallace from my car. "They've blocked my private road with concrete barriers," I told him. "What are my options?" Spencer's voice took on the tone of a lawyer who'd just been handed a winning case. "Well, that's criminal trespass and property destruction for starters, but more importantly, it's proof that they're acting outside their authority. Are you ready to take this to the next level?" I watched Whitney at her window, probably congratulating herself on her decisive action. "Spencer," I said, "I want to register a private toll road. What do I need to do?" Spencer Wallace walked me through the process of establishing a private toll road with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed property law battles. "It's actually quite straightforward," he explained during our Friday afternoon meeting. "You own the road, you have the right to control access, and you can charge reasonable fees for usage. The key is documentation and proper signage." He slid a folder across his desk. "I've prepared all the necessary paperwork. Once we file this with the county, you'll have legal authority to charge tolls, install gates, and exclude anyone who doesn't pay." The plan was elegantly simple. I would install a professional gate system with clear signage indicating private property and toll requirements. Anyone wanting to use the road would need to pay a fee of $30 per vehicle. Those who couldn't or wouldn't pay would need to find alternative routes to their destinations. "What about emergency access?" I asked. Spencer smiled. "Emergency vehicles are exempt by law. Everyone else pays or finds another way. The beauty of this approach is that it's completely legal, properly documented, and puts you in control of the situation instead of reacting to their moves." Saturday morning, I hired a professional installation crew to remove the HOA's barriers and replace them with a proper gate system. The gate was electronic, controlled by a mobile app that would process payments and track usage. Professional signs clearly marked the area as a private toll road with fees required for passage. By noon, the installation was complete, and I had a functioning toll road that looked official because it was official. The crew chief handed me the controller and grinned. "Never seen anything like this in a residential area," he said, "but it's your property, your rules." Sunday morning at 6 a.m., the fun began. The first car to approach my gate was a red SUV that I recognized as belonging to one of Whitney's supporters from the neighborhood. The driver sat at the gate for several minutes, reading the signs and probably trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. When the reality sank in, I could see him making animated phone calls from his driver's seat. Within 20 minutes, there were 12 cars backed up at my gate, their drivers either paying the toll through the app or frantically calling friends and neighbors to figure out what was happening. By 7 a.m., my phone was ringing constantly. The first few calls were angry residents demanding I remove the gate immediately. Then came the confused calls from people who weren't sure if the toll road was legal. Finally, at 7:45, I got the call I'd been expecting. "Mr. Mercer, this is Whitney Langford. What you've done is illegal and unacceptable. Remove that gate immediately or face serious legal consequences." Her voice was shaking with rage, but I could hear something else underneath. Fear. She was starting to realize that her legal threats might not carry the weight she thought they did. "Good morning, Mrs. Langford," I replied calmly. "The gate is completely legal. This is a private road on my property, and I have every right to control access and charge fees. If you have concerns about the legality, I'd suggest you consult with your attorney." There was silence on the other end for several seconds. "You can't charge people to use a road they've been using for 15 years, she finally said. "That's not how it works." I looked out my window at the growing line of cars at my gate. "Actually, that's exactly how property rights work. 15 years of unauthorized usage doesn't create any legal obligation on my part to continue allowing it." The conversation went downhill from there, with Whitney making increasingly desperate threats about lawsuits, police involvement, and community action. When she finally hung up, I called Spencer to let him know the toll road was operational and Whitney was considering her options. "She'll probably call the police," he warned. "When they arrive, just show them your documentation. You're completely in the right here." Sure enough, within an hour, I had 2 sheriff's deputies at my door. They were professional and thorough, reviewing all my documents and asking detailed questions about the situation. After 20 minutes, the senior deputy handed back my paperwork and shook his head. "Well, Mr. Mercer, this is definitely unusual, but it appears to be legal. You own the property, you've followed proper procedures, and you have the right to control access." By Monday morning, the toll road had become the talk of Pine Valley. Some residents paid the fee and continued using the shortcut, grumbling but accepting the new reality. Others found alternative routes and spread word about the situation through the community. The local coffee shop was buzzing with conversations about property rights, HOA overreach, and whether what I'd done was brilliant or vindictive. I fell into the brilliant category, personally, but I understood they were different perspectives. Whitney, meanwhile, was not handling the situation well. I learned from Evelyn that she'd called an emergency HOA board meeting for Tuesday evening, threatening to hold it every night until the board agreed to take action against me. The meeting was held at the community center, and I decided to attend. Not to defend myself, but to make an offer that Whitney would probably refuse but the community might find reasonable. I arrived wearing my best suit and carrying another folder of documents, projecting the kind of calm professionalism that Whitney's neon blazers never quite achieved. The meeting was standing room only, with residents who'd never shown interest in HOA politics suddenly very concerned about property rights and road access. Whitney called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a tirade about my toll road, describing it as an attack on community values and neighborhood harmony. "This man is holding our community hostage," she declared, pointing at me dramatically. "He's trying to profit from roads that belong to all of us." When she finished her speech, I stood up and requested permission to address the board and the community. "I have a simple proposal," I announced. "I'll remove the toll road and allow free community access under 2 conditions. First, Mrs. Langford must publicly acknowledge that my property is outside the HOA's jurisdiction and retract the violation notice she issued. Second, she must resign from her position as HOA president and issue a formal apology for exceeding her authority." The room erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations. Whitney's face went through several shades of red before settling on a color that approximately matched her blazer. "Absolutely not," she snapped. "I will not be blackmailed by someone who's trying to destroy this community." I nodded calmly and sat back down. "Then the toll road remains in effect. Thank you for your time." As I left the meeting, I heard Whitney's voice rising behind me, making more threats about legal action and community solidarity. But I also heard other voices. Residents asking questions about HOA boundaries and wondering aloud whether Whitney had been operating outside her authority with other homeowners too. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were going to grow into something Whitney couldn't control. The next few days were interesting to say the least. My toll road was generating about $300 per day in revenue, not because I needed the money, but because it was forcing people to confront the reality of property rights. More importantly, it was giving me time to dig deeper into Whitney's background and her activities as HOA president. What I found was disturbing, but not surprising. Working with Evelyn, who turned out to have excellent research skills from her paralegal days, I discovered a pattern of suspicious behavior spanning Whitney's entire tenure as president. She had been systematically targeting specific homeowners with violation notices, often for trivial or questionable issues. But here's where it got interesting. Every single violation notice was followed by a recommendation for the same contractors to fix the problems. Contractors like Troy Huxley, who had been given exclusive HOA maintenance contracts despite higher bids from other companies. "Look at this," Evelyn said, spreading financial documents across her kitchen table. "In the last 2 years, the HOA has paid Troy's company over $40,000 for various projects, consistently 30 to 40% higher than comparable work done by other contractors in the area." The HOA meeting minutes revealed closed-door decisions and vague justifications for expenditures. Whitney had been operating the HOA like her personal fiefdom, making unilateral decisions and using her position to benefit herself and her preferred contractors. "She's been running a scam," I told Evelyn, using HOA authority to create problems that require expensive solutions from her chosen contractors. The breakthrough came when Travis Reed, Whitney's brother-in-law and reluctant HOA board member, approached me privately. Travis was a decent guy who'd gotten involved with the HOA board only because his wife felt family loyalty required it, but Whitney's increasingly erratic behavior was making him uncomfortable. "I can't be part of this anymore," he told me during a chance encounter at the local hardware store. "Whitney's lost it completely. She's talking about organizing protests, contacting the media, even hiring a private investigator to dig up dirt on you." Travis provided me with information that I couldn't have obtained any other way. Email exchanges between Whitney and Troy discussing strategy for creating compliance issues, financial records showing inflated charges for HOA projects, and most damaging of all, recordings of Whitney's conversations with potential buyers for properties she was trying to force onto the market. "She's been trying to buy distressed properties at below-market prices," Travis explained, creating problems for homeowners, then offering to solve those problems by purchasing their houses. Armed with this evidence, I realized that Whitney's campaign against me wasn't really about community standards or property values. It was about control, money, and the fact that I represented a threat to her carefully constructed system of manipulation. My toll road wasn't just inconveniencing residents, it was exposing her methods and undermining her authority. She needed to destroy my credibility before people started asking too many questions about her activity. But sitting in my cabin that evening, surrounded by evidence of Whitney's corruption, I found myself questioning what I was about to do. I'd lived my entire life avoiding confrontation. After my divorce, after the stress of rebuilding my career as a freelancer, all I wanted was peace. I bought this cabin to escape drama, not create it. The idea of turning this into a public battle felt exhausting. Maybe I should just present the evidence quietly, get Whitney to back down, and return to my weekend retreats, without all this chaos. I'd never been the kind of person who fights back publicly. I solve problems with code, with logic, with quiet persistence, not with toll roads and media attention and community meetings. But then I made the mistake of checking local social media that night. Whitney had gone live on the neighborhood group, and she was spinning a story that bore no resemblance to reality. "This man has been harassing me for weeks," she said, her voice trembling with fake emotion, "making threatening phone calls, following me around town, and now he's trying to extort money from hardworking families just trying to get to work and school. I'm scared for my safety and the safety of our community." The comments were filling up with support for Whitney, with neighbors expressing outrage at my criminal behavior and calling for police intervention. I sat there watching her lie with such conviction, painting herself as the victim while completely omitting her role in creating this situation. She was good at this manipulation, I had to admit. She understood exactly how to present herself as the reasonable community leader being attacked by an unstable outsider. And people were believing her. That's when something shifted inside me. I'd spent my whole life being reasonable, being quiet, being the person who doesn't make waves. And where had it gotten me? Divorced, isolated, and now being publicly slandered by someone who was using her position to exploit the very people she was supposed to serve. I realized that my desire to avoid confrontation had been enabling people like Whitney my entire life. Every time I'd backed down, every time I'd chosen peace over principles, I'd made it easier for bullies to continue their behavior. This wasn't really about my cabin anymore. It was about whether decent people could live their lives without being manipulated by those who understood that most of us just want to be left alone. Whitney was counting on my desire for peace. She was betting that I'd eventually give up and disappear rather than fight back publicly. That night, I made a decision that went against every instinct I'd developed over 35 years of conflict avoidance. I wasn't going to just defend myself anymore. I was going to expose Whitney Langford for what she really was. A small-time con artist who'd been using her HOA position to manipulate and exploit her neighbors. I was going to gather every piece of evidence, every testimony, every document that revealed her pattern of abuse. And then I was going to present it all publicly with media present so that everyone could see exactly what kind of person they'd elected to represent their community. Whitney wanted a war. She was about to get one, but it would be fought with facts, not protests. I spent the following week preparing for what I privately called the presentation, working with Spencer Wallace, Evelyn Monroe, and Travis Reed to compile a comprehensive case against Whitney's abuse of power. We had financial records, email evidence, testimony from harassed residents, and recordings of her discussing property manipulation schemes. Whitney thought she could intimidate me with legal threats and public lies, but she had no idea what kind of reckoning she'd just brought upon herself. I spent the following week preparing for what I privately called the presentation. Working with Spencer Wallace, Evelyn Monroe, and even Travis Reed, I compiled a comprehensive case against Whitney's abuse of power. We had financial records showing inflated contractor costs, email evidence of her coordination with Troy Huxley, testimony from residents she'd harassed, and recordings of her discussing property manipulation schemes. Most importantly, we had documentation proving that she'd been operating outside the HOA's legal authority for months, if not years. The venue was the Pine Valley Community Center, the same place where Whitney had tried to rally support against me just 2 weeks earlier. But this time, I was the one calling the meeting. I sent invitations to every resident in the area, contacted the local newspaper reporter who'd been covering the toll road story, and even reached out to a regional television station that had expressed interest in HOA dispute. The event was billed as a community forum on property rights and HOA authority, but everyone knew it was really a showdown between Whitney and me. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather and perfect attendance. The community center was packed with over 90 residents, many of whom had never attended an HOA meeting in their lives. The local news reporter was setting up her camera equipment, and neighbors were whispering with anticipation. Whitney arrived fashionably late, wearing a bright red blazer and accompanied by Colleen Miller and 2 other board members, all carrying folders and wearing expressions of grim determination. Whitney requested to speak first, claiming that as HOA president, she had the right to address the community before anyone else. I agreed, partly because I was confident in my evidence, and partly because I wanted everyone to see her in action before I revealed what I'd discovered. Whitney's speech was a masterpiece of manipulation and misdirection. She painted herself as a dedicated community leader, fighting to protect property values against an outsider trying to profit from the neighborhood's resources. She brought up my toll road, my non-compliant cabin, and what she called my pattern of aggressive behavior toward longtime residents. She even managed to work up some tears when talking about the stress she'd endured. "I never asked for this job," she said, her voice breaking. "I took it because someone had to stand up for the values that make Pine Valley a special place to live." Several residents applauded when she finished, and I could see that she'd managed to sway some people who hadn't made up their minds. Whitney was good at this. She understood how to appeal to emotions and present herself as the victim even when she was the aggressor. But she'd also just given me the perfect setup for what came next. I walked to the front of the room with my laptop and projector, connected everything smoothly, and faced the crowd with calm confidence. "Thank you, Mrs. Langford, for that heartfelt speech about community service," I began. "Now, I'd like to share some information about how that service has actually been performed over the last 2 years. The first slide showed a comparison chart of contractor costs, clearly demonstrating how Troy Huxley's company had consistently charged 30 to 40% more than market rates for identical work. I methodically walked through the evidence: inflated contracts, coordinated violations that created work for preferred contractors, and Whitney's pattern of targeting specific homeowners with questionable citations. When I played the audio recording of Whitney discussing her property acquisition strategy, the room fell silent. Her own voice filled the space. "Just give me 6 more months, and I'll force out at least 5 more families. These people don't understand that I'm offering them a way out of situations I can make much worse." The collective gasp was audible. Whitney stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair. "Those recordings are illegal," she shouted. "This is harassment and character assassination." But her voice was shaking, and everyone could see she was panicking rather than defending herself with facts. I played one more recording where she discussed specific residents by name, planning violation strategies that would force them to either comply with expensive demands or sell their properties. The community response was swift and unanimous. Evelyn Monroe stood up and began a slow clap that spread through the entire room. Travis Reed publicly apologized for his role in enabling Whitney's behavior and announced his resignation from the HOA board. When someone called for an immediate vote of no confidence, it was unanimous, except for Colleen Miller, who abstained. Whitney's final meltdown was spectacular. As the meeting began to break up, she grabbed the microphone and screamed that the whole thing was a conspiracy, that I had somehow manipulated everyone, and that she would not be driven out by lies and illegal recordings. Security volunteers had to escort her from the building while she continued shouting threats and accusations. As I packed up my presentation materials, the local news reporter approached me for an interview. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "this is quite a story, a toll road revenge that exposed HOA corruption. How does it feel to have your property dispute turn into a community revolution?" I looked around the room at residents who were still discussing what they'd learned and planning how to reform their homeowners association. "It feels like justice," I said finally. "Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone." The local news story aired that Sunday evening, but by Monday morning it had gone viral. The video of Whitney's meltdown, combined with the story of how a toll road had exposed HOA corruption, struck a nerve with people across the country who'd had their own experiences with overzealous homeowners associations. Within a week, the story had been picked up by national media outlets, and I was fielding interview requests from reporters who wanted to explore the larger issues of property rights and community governance. Whitney's downfall was swift and comprehensive. By Tuesday, she had been formally removed from her position as HOA president by an emergency vote of the board. By Wednesday, residents had initiated a formal audit of all HOA finances during her tenure, revealing even more irregularities than I had uncovered. By Friday, 3 separate families had filed complaints with the state attorney general's office regarding Whitney's harassment and potential fraud. Her reign of terror over Pine Valley was officially over. The consequences for her co-conspirators were equally satisfying. Troy Huxley lost all of his HOA contracts immediately, and when word spread about the inflated billing practices, several other clients began reviewing their own invoices. Within a month, his business had lost so much work that he was forced to lay off employees and downsize operations. Colleen Miller resigned from her position as HOA secretary and quietly moved to another state, apparently unable to face the community backlash over her role in documenting Whitney's fictional violations. For me, the resolution was more positive than I had dared to hope. I removed the toll road system within a week of the community meeting, but I maintained the private road status with a signed easement agreement that allowed community access while protecting my property rights. The gesture was seen as magnanimous by residents who had initially been inconvenienced by the tolls, and it helped establish me as someone who was interested in solutions rather than revenge. The community healing process was remarkable to witness. Evelyn Monroe was elected as interim HOA president, and under her leadership, the association began implementing reforms that emphasized transparency, accountability, and respect for residents' rights. Monthly meetings became collaborative sessions focused on genuine community improvement rather than petty enforcement action. Property values actually increased as word spread that Pine Valley had become a model of reasonable HOA governance. My own life took some unexpected turns. The media attention led to consulting opportunities with other communities dealing with HOA disputes, and I found myself becoming something of an expert on property rights and community governance. More personally, I started dating Sarah Monroe, Evelyn's daughter, who turned out to be an environmental lawyer with her own interesting stories about fighting institutional overreach. The cabin that had started this whole adventure became the site of weekend gatherings for neighbors who had become genuine friends through shared adversity. But the most satisfying resolution came 6 months later, when I learned that Whitney's house was going on the market. The combination of legal fees, lost income from her property schemes, and social ostracism had forced her to sell and relocate to another state. The irony was perfect. The woman who had tried to force other residents to sell their homes below market value was now in exactly that position herself. When my real estate agent called to tell me the house was available, I didn't hesitate. I bought it immediately, not out of spite, but because it completed the transformation of what had been Whitney's base of operations into something positive for the community. I converted Whitney's former house into a short-term rental property that I marketed specifically to people seeking peaceful retreats and quiet getaways. The reviews were consistently excellent, with guests praising the serene environment and respectful community atmosphere. The rental income was nice, but the symbolic victory was priceless. Whitney's former seat of power had become a place where stressed city dwellers came to find the same peace she had tried to deny me. A year later, Pine Valley had become something of a model community. Property values were up 18%, not because of aggressive HOA enforcement, but because of the neighborhood's reputation for reasonable governance and community cooperation. We were featured in a regional magazine as an example of how homeowners associations could serve residents rather than terrorize them. Evelyn continued as HOA president, elected by unanimous vote, and the monthly meetings became social events that people actually enjoyed attending. As for Whitney herself, I heard through various channels that she had moved to a different state and was working in retail management. She had deleted all her social media accounts after becoming an internet meme, and apparently had no desire to revisit her time in Pine Valley. I felt no animosity toward her anymore, just a kind of distant satisfaction that justice had been served and the community had emerged stronger from the experience. Sitting on my cabin porch on a quiet Sunday evening with Sarah grading law school papers beside me, I reflected on how the whole situation had unfolded. What started as a simple desire to paint my cabin a color I liked had turned into a community-wide reckoning with abuse of authority. My toll road, which had seemed like such a dramatic response at the time, had become the catalyst for positive change that benefited everyone, except the people who deserved consequences. People often ask me if I planned the whole thing from the beginning, if I somehow knew that standing up to Whitney would expose her broader pattern of corruption. The truth is, I just wanted to enjoy my coffee on the cabin porch without someone telling me my mug was the wrong color. But when someone tries to block your path to peace, sometimes you have to build a new road. And sometimes that new road leads to justice for everyone who's been waiting for someone brave enough to stand up to the bullies. The tollgate hardware is still in my garage, a reminder of what can happen when property rights meet creative problem solving. Whitney's former house continues to host guests who appreciate quiet weekends and respect for boundaries. The Pine Valley Homeowners Association serves its community with transparency and fairness. And my cabin remains forest green, exactly the color it should be, surrounded by neighbors who understand that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well on your own private road. So that's my story, a tale of HOA overreach, property rights, and the satisfaction that comes from turning the tables on bullies who think they can intimidate decent people into submission. If you've enjoyed this journey through small-town politics and strategic problem solving, let me know in the comments. And remember, if you're dealing with your own HOA drama, knowledge is power. Documentation is your friend, and sometimes the best defense. Thanks for listening to my story, and may your own battles with bureaucracy end as satisfyingly as mine did.